Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos. Yeah.
Can I have your attention, please?
Good luck.
It's my privilege to introduce the next speaker, Bill Silver, who will tell you about a very important piece of paper that we want back from him.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want you all to know that we're getting together very shortly, and the nominations for the Thomas Clark Award are coming up right away almost. So if you have any nominations, please get them in as soon as possible. Deadline is coming up in a couple of weeks, and you really have to know, and you'd like to know, the nominations that you make that award. Thanks very much. No applause. Very nice. While we're waiting for the rabbi to start, I just want to say I've been attending the rabbi's class at the University of Miami. It's a 200-level class in the religion department, and it's extraordinary to see a rabbi teaching these students, defining the role of a rabbi, guarding a body of knowledge of Judaism, and introducing that to 15 young adults in the university. It's truly an amazing experience for me. And he invited me to join him in this class, and I'm sure he will extend the invitation to anyone else who is available on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9:30 to 10:45.
Oh, thank you, Alfred. Much appreciated. Here's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the reverse of that. I'm looking for someone to come to the UM class and tell them how wonderful I am here. I'm looking for the reverse. Hey, happy birthday. Today's your birthday, right? Mazel tov. It's Anita's birthday. Yom Huledet Sameach, Yom Huledet Sameach, Yom Huledet Sameach, Yom Huledet Sameach. Mazel tov. All right, here we go. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asod לדורותם ברית עולם ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם אותי לעולם ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם וביום השביעי שבת וינפש שבת וינפש ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי הגפן Amen. L'chaim. Okay. I have to do without Bobby's jokes for today. Okay. Blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay, Torah portion is called Shoftim. Hopefully you have a sheet. They went around. If not, there's plenty more in the back. Has all the sources for today. Hello to everybody, or to both of you who are watching at home. We are up to the very beginning of Shoftim, which the Torah portion begins in chapter 16 of Deuteronomy, beginning with verse 18, which is like an interesting verse number to start a Torah portion, 18. Shoftim is one of the, it's a Torah portion whose name is also the name of another book in the Tanakh, right? We have, Shoftim means judges, and in addition to the Torah portion called Shoftim, there's another book in the Hebrew Bible called Judges, which in Hebrew is Shoftim, right? A shofet is even in modern Hebrew the word for judge. So what we have here is a case where you're appointing judges who are going to lead you, but the judges who then become the judges later on, and there were 12 of them in the book of Judges, don't resemble the description of what you get here as judges at all. So some of them you've heard of, some of them you haven't. You've probably heard of Samson. Right? You may have heard of Deborah. You're probably not as familiar with Ehud, right, or Othniel, right, or some of the others, but in the book of Judges, the judges are generally not people who judge the community in terms of what we think of legal setting. They were mainly military leaders. And if you look through all the story, what would happen is, in the period of Judges, remember, when the Jews came into the land of Israel, it took a couple hundred years before King Saul is appointed king. So there's this interim period where there's no real leader. And worse, the tribes were separated into their apportioned lands within the land of Israel, and they weren't really connected to each other. In fact, sometimes they even fought with each other. And there was no central leader. Right? It was sort of, everyone was ruled in their own, state, but there was no central leader. And what would happen is they would sin. And in a certain area, the sins would be really bad. And the punishment would be that one of the neighboring countries would come and attack them, and it looked like they were losing, so they'd cry out to God, and they'd repent for their sins, and God would send someone to save them. And that would be some kind of person that's referred to as a judge, who generally would then lead a military campaign to defeat whoever was threatening them. So what's a problem is, when we get to a book called Judges, they don't resemble what the Torah says a judge should be. You see the issue so far? Okay. So with that in mind, let's try to figure out why there's judges. Now, the biggest problem is this. Well, I don't want to give it away, but we have a lot of material to get to today. So a lot of material to get to today is code, for unless your question's really good. All right, forget it. Okay, here we go. Can you use the mic? Do we have a mic?
Just straighten me out. I thought that the object was to create judges and to create the law.
Yes.
So that people would follow religion, and therefore the judges would be from a more religious, Levites or whatever background. The whole idea was basically that the law and Judaism were very close. We're one.
100%. That's what it's supposed to be.
Right.
That's not.
So you're jumping.
Well, that's what it's supposed to be, but it doesn't turn out so well. It doesn't turn out so well. Even more so is who comes after the judges, which is the kings. And the Torah in this week's Torah portions explains, well, if you have a king, here's what a king is supposed to be. And here's what a king is supposed to be, different than all the other nations that have kings. But that didn't happen either. It happened in the beginning with David and Solomon, but then even at the end of Solomon's career, it turned out very poorly. Okay. All right, so let's get into it. We'll see where we're going. And hopefully by the end of this, we'll make a point. It's always good when you're teaching to have a point. Okay, so we can finally start off correctly now that Norman, welcome back. We've managed without you. It wasn't easy. We wandered through the book of Numbers. You get it? We wandered. Okay. All right, here we go. Verse 18, Norman.
You shall appoint magistrates and officials for your tribes in all the settlements that the Eternal your God is giving you, and they shall govern the people with due justice.
Who's they?
Magistrates.
Not just magistrates. Good. What's shotrim? Enforcers. So when you say they, the judges and the officers. Shotrim is the modern Hebrew word also for police officer. Okay? If you don't have police officers and you have judges who enforce, who make judgments, but you don't have someone to enforce it, then you have nothing. Right? If you don't have someone to enforce it, you have nothing. Right? It's like when I tell the 7th grade parents, your kids have to come to class to have a bar bat mitzvah, and then they don't come to class, and we still have the bar bat mitzvah. What am I going to do? You know? I need the kids to have the bar bat mitzvah too. It's like when we tell you, we won't bury you if you have a tattoo. We still do. We can't enforce it. We have threat. You can have threats, but if you can't enforce it, you have nothing. Okay. Here we go. Let's keep going.
You shall not judge unfairly. You shall show no partiality. You shall not take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of just. Justice, justice shall you pursue.
Right. Anyone ever heard that before? I'm not familiar with it. They don't teach that in Reform Rabbinic School. They're not interested in that verse. I'm kidding. We had a whole year on it. All right, forget it.
Justice,
Some
justice
of this is funny.
shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Eternal your God is giving you. You shall not set up a sacred post, any kind of pole beside the altar of the Eternal your God that you may make, or erect a stone pillar, for such the Eternal your God detests. You shall not sacrifice to the Eternal your God an ox or a sheep that has any defect of a serious kind, for that is abhorrent to the Eternal your God. If there is found among you in one of the settlements that the Eternal your God is giving you, a man or woman who has affronted the Eternal your God and transgressed to the covenant, turning to the worship of other gods and bowing down to them, to the sun or the moon or any of the heavenly host, something I never commanded, and you have been informed or have learned of it, then you shall make a thorough inquiry. If it is true, the fact is established, that abhorrent thing was perpetrated in Israel, you shall take the man or woman who did that wicked thing out to the public place, and you shall stone that man or woman to death.
Okay. So I just want to look at a few Rashis on the first 3 verses here. So if you look on the sheet. Okay, so judges and bailiffs, or shotrim, you can Safaria translates it as bailiffs, but it really means enforcers. And the way the Talmud describes it, these were people who would go around town and they would do things, like they would make sure that weights and measures were even. They would make sure that people were following the rules as they were supposed to, like police officers do. So the shoftim are the judges who make the sentence, and the shotrim are those who chastise the people. and at their judge's order, beating and binding the recalcitrant with a stick and a strap until he accept the judge's sentence. Okay, so you had to have people who enforce the laws. Now, you have this in some countries where it's not moral, right? I think of Iran, where they have the morality police. These were not morality police. This was what the judge ruled in court. So if you're not going to come and do that, then, we have to encourage you to do that. Otherwise, we have no system of law. By the way, one of the great things about this Torah portion is we take all of this for granted. A system of law with judges and courts and police didn't exist. This is a gift we gave to the world. What you have before this is you went into the courtroom and the courtroom said, you know what? You look guilty. And the guilty person would say, yeah, but what if I gave you a bribe? How would I look then? You look better. And so the Torah is going to come and say, your judges aren't allowed to take bribes. Your judges aren't allowed to do all the other things that the other judges were doing, including, what would the other judges do? Sorcery and witchcraft. And they'd throw up a stick, and it would land pointing at this guy. You must be guilty. The God put the stick at you. So the Torah says, we don't do that. This is a new way of looking at court systems that didn't exist before. Okay. Yeah, can you use the mic?
Did such stonings ever take place?
So the Talmud really argues not really. And the Mishnah says that any court that gave someone the death penalty within 100 years is a barbaric court. So, they tried to do everything possible, and the Torah portion gets into it later. In order for someone to get the death penalty, this is explained in the Talmud in a tractate called Sanhedrin, where it talks a lot about this stuff in the 50s, the 50-page number of Sanhedrin. It talks about, in order for someone to get the death penalty, they had to be warned what they were doing was illegal and it came with the death penalty twice. And they had to have heard that warning and said, I hear the warning, I know I'm going to get the death penalty, and I still want to do it, and then they go and do it. And there have to be 2 witnesses who see it. All of that has to happen in order for someone to get the death penalty, which didn't happen very often, if at all. Maimonides often talks, there's a case called the Ben Sorer Umoreh. Anyone ever heard of this? It's the case where you have the son who's, what's the word in English? The disobedient child, right? And it says, if he's cursing his father, so you go out and kill him. So Maimonides says, this never happened. No, there's never been a documented case of this ever happening. But it's strong language in the Torah to say, look, you got to respect your parents. Okay, so yeah, probably not. Now, look on verse 19, the second Rashi here. Verse 19 says, you shall not pervert judgment, you shall not take notice of someone's presence, and you shall not take a bribe, and so forth. Okay, so Rashi says, divrei tzadikim means the words which have been described by the term righteous, the judgments of truth uttered on Sinai. So, when he says divrei tzadik, what's a tzadik? Someone who's righteous. In order to be able to give a judgment that is tzedek, in order to give a judgment that is tzedek, you need to be a tzaddik, right? If you're not a righteous person, you can't be a judge. Right? You can't just win the election. Right? You have to actually be righteous. Otherwise, the words that you're giving are useless. So, and you see this sometimes, especially in courts. Like, look at the Russian courts. The nonsense that they come up with, the political theater that they come up with. And you have like Evan Gersanovich or someone like this, who's in a court of law being sentenced to living in a hell for however many years for the crime of what? Being a spy, really? He's worked for a newspaper. And then you have this judge sitting up there representing righteousness. Scott Bernstein, he's actually in Portugal right now teaching. But he teaches classes on this. The Nazis had a court system. And the judges preached righteousness. What? So you could have a judge sitting there in a chair preaching morality who's not a tzaddik. Doesn't work. It's corrupt. Can't have it. So that's what verse 19 is all about. Okay, and then finally, tzedek tzedek tirdof, which means go out and do social action, and don't wear tefillin, and don't keep kosher. It's essentially, it's Reform Judaism in a nutshell. But I mean, it's true. You know, we're not keeping Shabbos. Okay, so if you look at verse 19, what does it really mean? Okay, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, which has become the rallying cry for social action, which is fine. Social action is a mitzvah, but it's not all the mitzvahs. So that you will live and take possession of the land your God. What it really means, and why it says tzedek, tzedek, why it says it twice, according to what it says here is, let's say you go to a court, and the court isn't sure. And you don't feel like you've gotten a real just claim. Tzedek, go to a higher court. Seek a different court. So everyone back then, they lived in a certain area. And all those areas had a local court. But there were many times where the local court wasn't that good. Because what was a local court? A local court was if you have 3 judges, great. But let's say you live in an area where they don't have 3 judges. They only have 1 judge. So what do? They get 2 other guys who know their stuff. Like 2 other guys who took this class. Right? But never went away to study in Jerusalem with the top rabbis and never got ordained. So you have only 1 guy who's actually ordained sitting on the court. So the case is really complicated. And you're listening to these 2 guys, and eventually they say, look, we're not sure, but we think this. So your lawyer should say, I'm appealing this. The judges themselves need to say, we're not sure. Go to Jerusalem. We've got experts there. Or go to the Capitol and they have experts there, and if you don't like there, then... But tzedek tirdof means let's not stop until we find out what the real solution, what the real judgment is supposed to be. Tzedek tirdof, go get justice. Okay, tzedek tirdof, don't stop until you're certain that you've gotten the right answer. That's what it means in context of the Torah. It's been taken in a variety of different ways, which is fine. That's what rabbis do. That's actually what the Midrash does. Midrash takes a verse and runs all over the place with it. You can do that if you want. But what it means in the simple context is make sure that the case gets solved to the best that's possible. Okay. Now, I want to skip. So the idea is you need to have these judges. And that really should be it. You got prophets, you got judges, and that's who will lead the Jewish people. And that's currently what's going on. Moses is not a king. In fact, if you remember, when Moses was standing up and judging the people, Yitro came up to him and said, the thing that you're doing is not right. And we understand that to be that he needs help. Or he needs other people to appoint as judges too, which he says that's fine, and he does that. But the implicit lesson there is, Yitro says to Moses, why do you stand up while everyone sits before you? Meaning to say, Moses, why are you acting like a king? You're not a king. The people you don't stand and everyone sits in front of you. Or you don't sit and everyone stands, whatever it is. But you look like a king. And Jews, we don't have kings. You're a prophet. We don't need a king. Unless we do need a king. Now, you know the story. The first king is who? Saul. How does Saul why is Saul appointed? Anybody remember? Why was Saul appointed king? I mean, they were going along for a couple hundred years without a king. When Joshua leads the Jewish people into the land of Israel, he's not a king. He's a leader, but he's a prophet. He's also a military leader, but he's a prophet. Then all of a sudden, Saul. Why? Because the people come and say, we need a king. And they say that to Samuel, who's the leader at the time. Samuel was a prophet. What does God say to Samuel when the people ask for a prophet, for a king? He says, it's not you, Samuel, are rejecting, it's me. And it makes it look over there like it's bad to have a king. But that's a problem for us in this week's Torah portion. It's a problem that it was not a good thing that they asked for a king. Why? So now look, chapter 17, verse 14. Now remember, before we look at chapter 17, verse 14 in Shoftim, we have to point out that when the Jews ultimately later on do come for a king, God says, it's because they're rejecting me, God. So it sounds horrible. But that makes no sense once we read what we're about to read. Okay, Edith, do you have verse 14?
If, after you have entered the land that your God Adonai has assigned to you, and take possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me, you shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by your God Adonai. Be sure to set as king over yourself one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kin. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses, since Adonai has warned you, you must not go back that way again. And he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. When he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching, written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priest.
Okay, so we learn here, if it ever happens that the people do come and say, by the way, when is this? The way it started, verse 14, when you get to Israel, when you're in the land of Israel. And when did it happen? When they got to Israel. So if you're a Jew living in Israel during the times of the judges, and you've read the Torah, and you want a king, you can have one. Why? Because the Torah just says you can have one. Now, I want to explain, we know how many mitzvahs are in the Torah, right? 613. Now, the Torah doesn't say anywhere in it that there are 613 mitzvahs. It's just, although there are some Kabbalistic allusions to it, but it just became a number that was accepted. And different rabbis started making lists of what those 613 mitzvahs are. They didn't always agree. Because sometimes you might see a mitzvah that's mentioned twice. And one rabbi would say, well, I read it, here it's telling us one thing, and here it's telling us the other thing, so that's two different mitzvahs. Where another rabbi might say, no, those are the same. That's one mitzvah. And over here, where you thought this was a mitzvah, it wasn't. So, like, the famous ones, Maimonides and Nachmanides, they have differences over how to, the main ones they get, but there's some slight differences on how they both get to 613. They agree that there's 613, but how you get to 613, they disagree sometimes. One of the disagreements is this mitzvah. So if you look now, Maimonides in his Mishnah Torah says, here's the mitzvah. So if you look in the middle of the page, Rambam Hilchot Melachim, which means the laws of kings, 1:1, right off the bat, he says, Israel was commanded to fulfill 3 mitzvahs upon entering Israel. First one, from our verse right here, Deuteronomy 17:15, choose a king. In other words, one of the 613 commandments is when the Jewish people get to the land of Israel, you have to assign a king. Nachmanides disagrees. Nachmanides says that's not a mitzvah. Okay, so if you look now, what's Nachmanides in Hebrew? Ramban. Right? It's easier to say Rambam and Ramban. Maimonides is Rambam with an M at the end. Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. Nachmanides, Ramban with an N at the end. Rabbi Moses ben Nachman. So two different guys with the same first name and the same job. So that's why they sound. Same benefits, same dental. Okay. All right, Ed, would you mind reading the Nachmanides? And thou shalt say, I will set a king over me. So this is Nachmanides commenting on the verse we just read, saying you need a king. This is really interesting stuff.
And thou shalt say, I will set a king over me. In the opinion of our rabbis, who say that the Israelites were obligated to fulfill 3 commandments upon their entry into the land, to appoint a king, etc., this verse is like, and thou shalt surely say, I will set a king over me. This is a positive commandment, for he has obligated us to say so after conquering and settling in the land. The expression is similar to, and thou shalt make a parapet for thy roof, which is also a matter of obligation and not one of choice, and other verses besides these. He mentioned, and thou shalt say, because it is commanded that the people come before the priests of the tribe of Levi and to the judge, and say to them, it is our wish that we set a king over us.
Okay, so far what he said is, here's why Maimonides believes that this is a commandment, and now he's going to say, here's why he's wrong. Okay.
It is my further opinion that this is also one of his allusions to future events. For so it happened when the people asked for Saul, saying to Samuel, now make us a king to judge us like all nations. And similarly it is written there, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us, etc. For what reason is there that the Torah should say in connection with a commandment, such as I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are round about me, when it is not proper for Israel to learn their ways, and neither be envious against the workers of evil. But this is an allusion to what will be, and therefore the section is written in an intermediate sense and not tense, and not in the form of a command, as I have already explained.
So what Nachmanides' view is, this is not one of the 613 commandments. It's very simply Moses' allusion to what's going to happen in the future. There's nothing to do. There's no mitzvah. There's nothing to do. It's just something that's going to happen. Okay. Now, Maimonides says no. There is one of the 613 mitzvahs is a mitzvah that's only going to happen one time. What's another mitzvah that's only going to happen 2 times? Build the holy temple. Right? Sometimes once that mitzvah is done, you can't do it anymore. That's it. It's over. But Nachmanides disagrees. Look, it doesn't matter. Whichever side you want to be on, Rambam or Ramban, it doesn't matter. The point is, Nachmanides' point is, that this isn't a command to appoint a king. It's just Moses is telling the people, here's what's going to happen. But what's interesting about it is, Moses doesn't say it in a negative way. Like, it's terrible that you're going to have a king. Because later on, we see that God says, it's like they're rejecting me. This really is a terrible thing that you're appointing a king. That's not how Moses sees it. So what is Moses' objective here? Moses' objective is, I know this is going to happen someday. But when it happens, I want it to be done the right way. What's the right way? Not have too many horses, not have too many wives. A king was allowed to have 18 wives. Solomon had, like 1,000 or something. Which you could understand how he ended up going crazy at the end and, Again, by the way, this class, what happens in this class stays in it. You can't, don't go to my wife, right. Al,
In that same verse 14, isn't the fact that the request for having a king over myself, like all the nations that are around me, those nations which, some of which Amalek was supposed to wipe out from the earth, and many of which were idolaters and were supposed to not do that either.
all right, you're jumping ahead. I'm not there yet. You're giving away some of my best material. But yeah, so what's the difference? So like, for example, but just to point out what Moses says. Moses says, you might want to have a king that's going to have that's going to have too many horses. Like, you have, the king of North Korea has got a great collection of Ferraris. It's great. His people don't have any food, but he's got 92 Ferraris. Or maybe 1,000. How many times have we seen that throughout history? right? The king's got everything. He's doing fine. No one else has anything, right? I think that's what the French Revolution was about, right? Certain class of people have everything, and the rest of them let them eat cake, right? That's not uncommon. But let's think about this. The Torah specifically says not to have too many horses. You ever heard of Solomon's stables? He had too many horses. Right? Someone, a hand over here? No? Okay. Now, one of the ideas, a king's, Rashi gets into the halacha that a king's allowed to have up to 18 wives. Solomon had hundreds and hundreds of wives. Solomon had the right idea, but the wrong method. So his idea was, if I marry every princess, or if I marry every queen, they'll get their nations to convert to Judaism. And through that way, the whole world will be Jewish. That was his idea. It was a terrible idea. And it didn't work. And not only did he not convert them to Judaism, they got him to worship idols. And at the end of his life, Solomon was worshiping idols. If you read the end of Solomon's life, it doesn't turn out very well. Okay, so, it didn't work. But and he had too many horses and so forth. Okay, so that's Ramban. Okay. I want to just share with you now what happened. You would think, and by the way, one other point, the king has to keep 2 copies of the Torah with him around and be reading the Torah all the time and living according to the Torah. And the point of being a king in Judaism was for the king to be an exemplar of what it meant to live a life of Torah. That was the point of being king. Not to be too rich, not to be too powerful, and so forth. Okay? Because that's what all the other kings did. Now, what happened in the book of Samuel when the Jewish people asked Samuel for a king? So if you look on the back page, I just brought the verses from the Tanakh, from the book of 1 Samuel chapter 8. Who's got a mic? Yeah. Hillary, would you mind reading where it says 1 Samuel 8, he said this will be?
He said, "This will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will appoint them as his chiefs of thousands and of 50s, or they will have to plow his fields, reap his harvest, and make his weapons and the equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize your choice fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 part of your grain and vintage and give it to his eunuchs and courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves, your choice young men and your asses, and put them to work for him. He will take 1/10 part of your flocks, and you shall become his slaves. The day will come when you cry out because of the king whom you yourselves have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you on that day."
Okay, so Samuel, a big fan of the idea of the king. Right? What's Samuel's argument to the Jews why maybe you don't want this? What do you see here? What's the problem? Nancy? Need a mic. Oh, can we pass? Is it, It's her birthday. Nothing bad can happen. Right. Except that you walk in this table. Except to me it can.
So Samuel is telling them what is going to actually happen because he knows.
You're also going to take my good material.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
I'm
fine.
sorry. But, well, not.
You guys are too smart for your own
He also
good.
is warning them to think. You think having a king is wonderful. Well, let me tell you all the stuff that happens.
Yeah.
Because look at all the other
Kings.
kings and their peoples. This is what happens, and you need to think about it. It's not always the best thing to be, quote, like everyone else,
Very good.
unquote.
Very
because
good.
we are not supposed to be that.
So, and by the way, we're going to build the temple. And you know who's going to end up building the temple? Y'all. Right? You're going to have to build this thing. And then once it starts working, you're going to have to give tributes to the king. and you're going to have to pay taxes. And there's going to be an army, and he's going to draft your kids into the army, and he's going to take your daughters to be his cooks and his bakers, and he's going to take your land, and he's going to take everything that you have, and he'll rule over you. And nobody else seems to enjoy that. Why would you want that? And the Jewish people come and say, that sounds great. We're okay with that. We want that. So we have to understand the milieu in which they requested it. What was going on at the time that they requested it? So one of the books that we hardly ever read, the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, there are all these judges, and the Jews are affiliated in this loose confederacy of different tribes in their apportioned lands, and they're not connected to each other. They have no unified army. They're susceptible to attack from their neighbors, and it's a free-for-all. And they're tired of the cycle of constantly being attacked and constantly having to pray to God to come and save them while so many people are being slaughtered at the hands of their enemies. And Amalek is running around like crazy and we can't get rid of them. And so they say, we need help. We need protection. And Samuel says, no, you don't. You just need to do the mitzvahs. Because if you do the mitzvahs, God will protect you. And the reason why God's not happy with you right now is because you're not doing the mitzvahs. If you would just do the mitzvahs, God would protect you. And the people say, it would be easier. You know what would be easier than doing the mitzvahs? Just give us a king who can put an army together and protect us. So look at there's a very famous line in Judges, the last verse in Judges. I brought it for you on the first side. Judges 21:25. Very famous line. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as they pleased. In other words, without a king, there was nobody to ensure that people would respect each other and treat each other well. There was also no way to ensure that people would do mitzvahs. And if you're someone who's doing mitzvahs, and you see lots of other people aren't doing mitzvahs, and then everyone gets attacked because you see these other people aren't doing the mitzvahs, and you're part of that getting attacked, you want a king to make sure that they do the mitzvahs, so you stop getting attacked. And if you're over here and you're not doing the mitzvahs, you want a king to protect you because you keep getting attacked. And so everyone says, you know how we can get rid of all of our problems? Let's just have a king like everybody else. Good? Can you use the mic?
What happened to the enforcers?
Okay. So the system of setting up the judges and the police was never put into place. Why? Because they weren't doing the mitzvahs. This is a mitzvah. A mitzvah is make sure you have judges and make sure that you... Now, when do we start to have judges? We know this from archaeology. If any of you have ever been to Tel Dan, you ever go to Tel Dan in northern Israel, in the Galilee, they've excavated almost the whole area. And one of the really cool things is they excavated the gate to the city. And the gate to the city, we know from lots of different evidence, literary and epigraphic evidence, is the gate of the city where the judges used to sit. And they actually uncovered at the gate the place where the judge sat. You can actually go there and see where the judge used to sit. And the people would come and be judged. He sat right in front of the gate. And they've excavated that whole area. But that excavation was from the time of the kings. From the time of the judges, you don't have anything like that. There were no real court systems in the time of the judges. But when the kings came up, they did start instituting court systems. Now, were they always just? No, because some of the kings were terrible. In fact, most of the kings were terrible. Most of the kings were worshiping idols and ended up collapsing. But there were at least courts. But it took a while. So one of the things we see here, to your point, the reason that was lawlessness is because nobody was following the judges. So why would a judge pop up? Why would someone like Samson pop up? Only in times of crisis. If it wasn't a time of crisis, they didn't have the court system. The Sanhedrin was in Jerusalem, but didn't really sit or exist until the Holy Temple was built. Didn't have a power base until the temple. And when the temple was destroyed, they ceased to exist. I mean, they became the rabbis, essentially, at that point. They were mainly the leaders of the Pharisaic movement who became the rabbis. Okay, good questions. Okay, so now, Nancy was alluding to it. But so they want to have a king. So they appoint Saul. Saul becomes king. But to be a king, you're supposed to be from the tribe of Judah. We know that from the end of Genesis, because at the end of Genesis, Jacob gives each of the tribes a blessing through a prophecy from God. And when he gets to Judah, he says, your tribe, you're the ones that are supposed to be the kings. Well, the first king is Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, which is a small, weaker tribe, although ends up living in Judah and gets wrapped into Judah. So you can see how it kind of makes sense. But Saul becomes king, but he refuses to wipe out Amalek, and he loses his job. Okay, fine. Now we have King David, and King David's a good king. And then we have King Solomon, and King Solomon's a good king. Although they both have their problems. You would not want to have been David or Solomon's psychologist. That would have been exhausting. That would have been exhausting. It would be a good play. That would be a really good play. Better than The Sopranos. In Sopranos, he's always going to his psychologist. You ever heard of that show? It was a show early 2000s.
It's on cable right now.
Yeah, they're playing it. Because tonight there's a documentary about the film, the maker. So they've been replaying it. So if you're into psychology, it's kind of a fun show. If you're okay. Also, if you like the mob, you know. Okay. What happens then after Solomon? After Solomon has a son named Rehoboam. Rehoboam becomes king and has a choice to make. So he says to his older advisors, what kind of king should I be? And they say, you should be like your dad. You should treat the people with wisdom and with caring and so forth. And then he goes to the younger people, his friends, and they say, what kind of king should I be? And they answer him. And so here's the answer. This is what they tell him. And then he goes to the people, and this is what he tells the people. If you look at 1 Kings chapter 12, here's what happens. My father imposed a heavy yoke on you, and I will add to your yoke. My father flogged you with whips, and I'll flog you with scorpions. And apparently being whipped with a scorpion hurts more than being hurt with a whip. Now, Solomon did have to be tough on the people. Why? Because they had to build the Holy Temple. And they did have some foreign labor to build the Holy Temple, but they also needed the Jews to build the Holy Temple. And so Solomon did put them to work. But Rehoboam said, but it was for a just cause. Why? Because we had to build the Holy Temple. It was a commandment. That's one of the 613 ways. You have to build the temple. So fine, so Solomon did that. But Rehoboam comes, and the temple's already built. And he said, my dad had a reason to whip you. I don't, but I'm going to do it even more. Thus Israel revolted and said, you know what? I'm not interested in this guy. And at that point, the kingdom split into two. And the southern kingdom became Judah under Rehoboam, and the only people who stayed were his tribe and Benjamin. And everyone else went to the northern kingdom called Israel. And eventually, a couple hundred years later, in 723 BCE, the north was conquered by the Assyrians, and they became the 10 lost tribes. And we haven't heard from them again until a few of them came back some time ago in Ethiopia. And they're the only Jews that we think, the Ethiopian Jews, who are now in Israel, that we can actually trace back to one of those 10 tribes who was in the north. The rest of them assimilated into Assyria, because it's kind of like what Stalin did. Stalin would take people and move them all around and mix them all up, so they lost their loyalty to wherever they're from. And the Assyrians did the same thing. And they mixed all the Jews up and moved them all around, and they're gone. We lost them. And that's the 10 lost tribes. So that's why today, any Jew that's left was from the south. The south was called Judea. And it was at that point we stopped being called the Israelites, and we started be calling people who are from Judea, which the way you say that is Jew. So that's why we're not Israelites anymore. That's why we're Jews. Right? We used to be the Israelites. Now we're the Jews. Why? Because we all come from Judea. And who was the first one to be called someone who's from Judea? Mordechai. It says in the scroll of Esther, Mordechai HaYehudi, because Mordechai was from Judea and he moved to Persia. And it says Mordechai HaYehudi, which means Mordechai, the guy who's from Judea. That's all Jew means, someone who's from Judea. But because all of the Jews in the world were now from Judea, we're the Jews, which in Hebrew was Yehudi. And Judah in Hebrew is Yehudah. So Yehudah, Yehudi, and female, Yehudiah. Not Yehudit. Yehudit is Judith. It's a name. Yehudiah is Jew female. And Yehudi is Jew singular, masculine. Okay, so now, someone made a good point. I forget who it was. But the verse we gave on Judges, is that in those days there was no king in Israel. Well, why not? And why would you even need judges? Why would you even need a king in Israel during the time period of Judges? You set up this system with the judges and the bailiffs. So what's the problem? So Rabbi David Kimchi, from about 800 years ago, has the answer. And he says, listen, here, this is the last source on the sheet. The reason this is mentioned was because in those days there was still not a king in Israel or a judge. They hadn't set up the judges either. And because of that, everything was a mess. So because they didn't do what they were supposed to, here's what this is. You have a rash. Doctor says, no problem, it'll go away. Just don't scratch it. So now you scratch it like crazy, and your whole arm is infected. You have to have your arm amputated. The whole thing's, you've just ruined the whole thing. All you had to do. It's the same thing with the Jews. You have a problem. You need justice. That's the rash. The problem is you need justice. No problem. Just appoint judges. Okay, they didn't appoint judges. Look at what Radak explains. He gets that from the Talmud. They didn't appoint judges. So now, instead of just having a rash, they've got a whole society that's about to collapse because there's no judgment. And the people are living in this society that's about to collapse, and they see the only way to do it is what everyone else does. Because the biggest fear when you have the society that's going to collapse is that we're going to be conquered. So we need an army. And everyone else, they have a great way of doing it. They have a king. So let's just have a king. No problem. We're allowed to have a king because there's a Torah portion called Shoftim, and in chapter 17 it tells us if you ever need a king, go ask for a king. Just make sure it doesn't have too many horses and perfume and wives and whatever. Okay, no problem. Give us a king. We'll monitor the horses. We're not moving back to Egypt. Everything will be fine. He'll write a Torah. He'll live the Torah. Everything will be great. We're allowed to do that. And so fine. Everything's fine. Until we get to the point where Samuel says, I don't think you guys want to do that. Because here's all the horrible things that are going to happen if you do. And they say, Samuel, we're okay with that. We're in such a bad state. We're okay with that. And Samuel says, okay, that's what you want. And God comes to Samuel and says, Samuel, don't feel bad. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. And now we come to our biggest problem. How could it be that if the Jews are allowed to have a king, that when they finally do ask for the king, they're rejecting God, and God's not happy about it? After all, God said you could have one. Moses alluded to the fact that it's going to happen. You've put in guardrails to make sure that when we do get the king, it'll be fine. And unfortunately, at 9:56, in my last 4 minutes of shining moment, my thunder by Alex has already been stolen, but that's okay. So what's the answer? The answer is they were allowed to ask for a king. Now, if they would have just said, give us a king who will judge us. Samuel said, fine, no problem. Give us a king who will live a life of Torah and be a moral exemplar for us. Fine, no problem. Give us a king who will not have too many horses and not have too many wives and will make sure we're all living Torah and who will lead an army and will help us build the temple. Sure, no problem. But once you said, give us a king, comma, so that we could be like all the other nations, now we have a problem. Because all the other nations have kings who are really powerful, who are kings for themselves, who don't care about the people, who judge on a whim, who use witchcraft and sorcery when they judge, which this Torah portion specifically says you're not allowed to, who take bribes, who favor the rich, who don't care about, that's what you're asking for. If you would have said, give us the king of Deuteronomy 17. Give us the king who's going to appoint judges. Give us the king who's not going to be like all the other nations. Give us a king who's going to live according to the Torah. God would have said, no problem. But the reason God said they're rejecting me is not because they asked for a king. It's for the kind of king that they desired. They didn't want the system of the king who rules according to the Torah. They didn't want the system of a king who seeks justice and who's not interested in riches and fame and all of that. They wanted the superstar king. They wanted the fancy kingdom. They wanted the big army. They didn't care so much about what went on the courts, and they sure as heck didn't care that he's sitting and reading Torah all day and enforcing them to follow the mitzvahs. And it was at that point, and for that reason, that God said, they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. And so this is the tension, I think, of being a Jew today, is we have to live in this world that we live in. And the word king or president or prime minister or whatever are terms that you need to live in this world today. Israel has to have a government. Right. Israel has to have a democratic government. America has to have a democratic government. But sometimes the people who are ruling, who end up in those positions, they're not ruling for the sake of justice. They're not ruling for all of the problems, the narcissism, the competition, the cruelty, that are human emotions, that are human things, have now infected what is supposed to be a holy position. And that ruins it for everybody. So our tension as Jews is to live in this world that we're forced to live in, which Maimonides called the sublunar world, right? The physical world. But try to live in that physical world according to spiritual principles. And that's where the tension is. And what happened here was God said, yes, I understand you live in a physical world, so fine, have a king. Okay, I get that. But he's got to govern according to the Torah. Because if he governs according to the physical nature of every other kingdom, then you're going to vanish into the dustbin of history, and you're not going to remain the Jewish people. I would actually say this. The most successful kings of the Jewish people, the most successful lines of the Jewish people, in my opinion, weren't called kings, they were called the rabbis. The rabbis who wrote the Talmud. And the only reason I say that is because of results. We're still around. We're still here. And we live according to Rabbinic Judaism. We live according to the Talmud. Now you might say, I'm not Orthodox, I don't follow the Talmud, but if you ever do the motzi, that's from the Talmud. If you have a mezuzah, that's from a Talmud. If you've ever been to a prayer service, that's from, everything that we do comes from the Talmud. Honor your mother and father. Okay, but how? What do you have to do? What does it mean, honor your mother and father? What are the things you have to do? Comes from the Talmud. So the rabbis were able to say, now that we're being kicked out of the land of Israel, if we don't design a way of being Jewish that allows us to take the spiritual principles and bring them into this world, we're not going to exist anymore. But the fact that we're still here, even after 2,000 years of exile, means that we've figured out a way to bring spirituality into our world. And that's what we call today being Jewish. It's a tension. But I actually think, with all the problems, the fact that we're still here after all this time, and we're going as strong as ever, and more people are studying Torah today than ever, I think we're actually doing pretty well. So, okay. Shabbat Shalom.